She thought she could claim my gate as shared property, until I locked it and exposed just how entitled she really was. My house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, protected by a single private gate that led to my driveway and backyard. The HOA allowed each homeowner to secure their own entrance, as long as it didn't affect anyone else. But Karen, our infamous HOA tyrant, didn't like rules. She liked control. For months, she used my backyard gate as her personal shortcut for her guests, gardeners, and delivery trucks. It wasn't shared property. It wasn't a common walkway. It was my gate, on my land, on my deed. I asked her nicely to stop. She laughed. So I stopped asking. One Saturday morning, I woke to the unmistakable sound of engines humming outside my window. At first, I thought it was just someone's delivery or a neighbor's visitor, but when I drew my curtains aside, I froze. A full caravan of cars, SUVs, hatchbacks, sedans, was lined up along the front of my property like I was hosting some kind of community festival. Confused, I stepped outside, only to realize the situation was worse than it looked. Karen was throwing a massive backyard brunch, apparently a yearly tradition she'd invented for herself, and her narrow driveway clearly couldn't handle the crowd. Her genius solution: use my land as her personal overflow parking lot. My gate, MY Gate, was wide open, and her guests were strolling through my yard like it was a public park. Not just passing by, but exploring, poking around, treating my space like scenery for their weekend outing. I spotted 3 strangers casually wandering past my tool shed, one of them lifting his phone to take a selfie with my property in the background. Another waved at me cheerfully, as if I was the one intruding on their event. Before I could even react, Karen strutted over from her backyard, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a steaming coffee cup like the CEO of Entitlement Inc. "Oh, perfect timing," she said breezily, as if I had come out to greet her guests. "We're having a little brunch. You don't mind, right? It's just easier this way. Shared space and all, shared space." As if repeating the phrase made it true. "It's not shared," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice level. My yard wasn't community property, wasn't part of the HOA's common areas, wasn't something she or her guests had any claim to. But Karen just smiled, that infuriating smirk, the kind that said she wasn't listening and didn't plan to. She waved a hand dismissively, turned around, and walked off without waiting for an answer. The message was clear. She had already decided my property was hers for the day. Maybe forever. I stood there, watching 2 more cars roll through my gate like they were following GPS directions that literally led them across my grass. A group of her guests dragged folding chairs through the middle of my yard, chatting loudly about mimosas and homemade pastries. One woman even complained about the slight unevenness of MY ground, loudly enough for me to hear. I couldn't believe the audacity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Karen had planned this. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't notified me. She had simply rearranged reality in her head where my gate, my yard, my property lines, all of it magically became an extension of hers whenever she found it convenient. And because she told herself it was easier, she assumed that meant it was allowed. As guests continued to pour in, I tried talking to a few of them, hoping maybe they didn't know they were trespassing. But every single one had the same attitude. Karen told them it was okay. Karen said it was shared. Karen said the neighbor didn't mind. Karen said whatever she needed to say to justify her delusion. At one point, a man set his drink on top of my tool chest like it was a bar counter. I watched sticky condensation drip down onto the metal I spent hours maintaining. Another person tugged open the side door of my shed, peeking inside like it was some kind of public attraction. When I shouted, "Hey, that's not yours," the woman actually laughed and said, "Karen said you keep extra chairs in here. Mind if we borrow some?" Borrow. My blood pressure spiked so hard I almost felt it in my teeth. That's when it hit me. Being polite wasn't getting me anywhere. Being reasonable wasn't working. Karen had mistaken my patience for permission and my silence for surrender. She assumed that because I wasn't the yelling type, she could walk all over me and hand the footprints out as party favors. I looked at my gate, wedged open by a broken brick someone had shoved underneath to keep it from swinging shut. I looked at the torn-up patches of grass where tires had already dug in. I looked at the strangers walking across my property like they owned it. And in that moment, something in me shifted. I realized Corinne wasn't going to stop unless someone stopped her. She wasn't going to respect boundaries because she didn't believe any applied to her. I took a slow breath and stepped back inside my house, ignoring the chatter, the laughter, the footsteps crunching through my yard. If she wanted to treat my property like a shortcut, a parking lot, and an extension of her living room, fine. But she had no idea that this time she'd pushed too far. And I was done being polite. Corinne wasted no time trying to flip the situation on its head. Less than 48 hours after hijacking my yard for her backyard brunch, she filed an official HOA complaint accusing me of gate obstruction. I stared at the notice taped to my door, wondering if it was a joke. According to her, I had intentionally restricted community flow by closing a gate that had traditionally been open for neighborhood activity. Neighborhood activity. Apparently, trespassing and backyard invasions now counted as recreation. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, I knew she'd make a scene, but even I underestimated the performance she had prepared. As soon as the meeting started, Corinne sprang to her feet like she was in a courtroom drama. She slapped her complaint down on the table, cleared her throat with theatrical intensity, and announced, "The gate at Lot 12 needs to remain open for community convenience." Gasps rippled through the room, mostly because half the people didn't even know there was a gate at Lot 12. But Corinne wasn't done. She lifted her chin, crossed her arms, and added, "It has always been an unofficial access point." Unofficial access point. The way she said it, you'd think my property was a public park she graciously allowed me to live on. The board members turned to me slowly, like they weren't sure whether to expect an argument or an explosion. Instead, I stayed calm. "That's not true," I said evenly. "It's privately owned. It's not listed on the HOA map, easement agreement, or property plan." Then I reached into my folder and handed them the documents I'd prepared, copies of the property lines, the original easement filings, the HOA boundary overlay, and photos proving the gate was entirely within my land. Corinne handed them nothing but attitude. She folded her arms tighter, rolled her eyes, sighed loudly, tapped her foot, and even muttered something about people who take things too seriously. But when the board members started reading my documents, her expression began to unravel. One board member asked, "Corinne, do you have any record of this being a shared access point?" She smiled stiffly. "Well, not official, but everyone knows. We've never received a request or approval for shared access," another interrupted. Corinne's jaw twitched. "It's just been understood," she insisted, but her confidence was thinning by the second. "Understood by who?" I asked. She snapped her head toward me and glared like I had personally ruined her performance. "By the neighborhood," she said, but the room was dead silent. Not a single person backed her up, not even her usual clique of HOA gossip partners. When she realized she had no support, not even a nod, her face tightened like a lemon being squeezed dry. Her hands fidgeted with her bracelet and her voice got sharper, more frantic. "Look, it's ridiculous for one homeowner to block a gate that benefits everyone. It's selfish and disruptive." "It's on my property," I repeated. "It benefits only you." A board member cleared his throat. "Based on the documents, the gate clearly belongs to Lot 12. There is no shared access designation, no easement, no historical use approval." Another board member added, "The HOA cannot claim access to a privately owned gate." Corinne's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The oxygen left her argument like air escaping a punctured balloon. Slowly, painfully, the realization dawned on her she had lost. The board sided with me officially, unanimously, completely. Corinne sat down so abruptly her chair screeched across the floor. She crossed her arms again, stared straight ahead, and refused to make eye contact with anyone. The meeting moved on, but she stayed frozen, simmering in humiliation. Watching her crumble should have felt like victory, but instead, something far more strategic clicked into place. As I gathered my papers and stood up to leave, an idea sparked in the back of my mind, sharp, clean, and perfectly justified. If she wanted to treat my gate like community property, Then maybe it was time to treat her entitlement like a problem that needed a permanent solution. She wanted access. She wanted convenience. She wanted control. But now I had the power to give her the exact opposite. For the first time since this whole situation began, I realized I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I had an opportunity, a real one, and Karen had absolutely no idea what was coming next. Wednesday morning came with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. After the HOA meeting, after watching Karen melt down in front of the entire board, I knew exactly what needed to be done. She had built her little fantasy where my gate belonged to the neighborhood, where her convenience mattered more than my rights, where my property was simply an extension of her empire. But fantasies end when reality shows up holding a drill and a steel lock. I woke early, grabbed my tools, and walked straight to the gate. The wood was sturdy, the hinges strong, but the old latch had always been simple, functional, but never meant to keep out a determined Karen. That was about to change. I installed a heavy-duty smart lock, steel, reinforced, password-protected, with a deadbolt that clicked shut loudly enough to echo across the yard. The sound was satisfying, like closing the lid on a box she'd been rummaging through for far too long. Above the lock, I installed a new sign, clean and bold, impossible to misinterpret. Private access TRSPSSERS will be recorded. It wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. My property, my rules, my boundaries. And for the first time they were physically, undeniably enforced. I had barely stepped back to admire my work when I saw movement in the corner of my eye, Karen's blind snapping open, her face appearing like a storm cloud trapped behind glass. She stared at the sign, at the lock, at me, and the transformation was immediate. She vanished from the window, and 20 seconds later her front door slammed. She marched across the lawn like an enraged general heading into battle, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy, robe swishing dramatically behind her like she was expecting paparazzi. "You can't do that," she shrieked before she even reached the gate. "This is shared property," her favorite line, her anthem of entitlement. I didn't flinch. "No," I said calmly, meeting her glare. "It's my property, and the HOA already confirmed that." Her jaw clenched so hard I heard her teeth grind. She looked at the lock like it personally offended her existence. "This is harassment," she snapped. "It's obstruction of community flow, it's hostile, it's petty." "It's legal," I replied, "and it's staying." She let out a frustrated growl, a full, primal sound, and stomped away, muttering things I'm pretty sure were HOA-approved vocabulary. Her door slammed again, shaking her entire porch railing. For the next 3 days she glared at the gate every time she passed by, as if trying to intimidate the lock into unlocking itself. She paced her yard, made phone calls, loud ones, intentionally loud, saying things like, "It's ridiculous," and "He's weaponizing his gate," and "I won't be bullied on my own street." Irony was clearly not her strong suit. Thursday evening I caught her trying to take pictures of the lock, possibly hopping to report me again. I waved at her. She nearly dropped her phone. Friday she made a performance of dragging her trash bins across her driveway with exaggerated stomps, glaring at me as if hopping I'd ask what was wrong. I didn't. The truth was I thought that would be the end of it, her tantrum, my silence, a stalemate she couldn't break. But Karen was not built for acceptance. She was built for drama. Which is why Saturday morning delivered a spectacle I could never have scripted. I was inside, making coffee, when I heard the sound of multiple engines outside. For a split second I thought she was throwing another brunch, but when I looked out the window my eyebrows shot up. Cars again. Lots of them. But this time they weren't guests. They were her relatives. Karen's extended family had arrived for some kind of birthday celebration, judging by the balloons I could see sticking out of one trunk. And true to her nature, Karen had clearly told them the same thing she told her brunch guests. "Oh, just go through the gate at the neighbor's place. It's easier." Except the gate was locked. Very, very locked. Her relatives pulled up to my property, confused, stopping their cars inches from the gate. People got out and rattled it. They pushed it. They tugged it. They tried to lift it off the hinges. One woman even knocked on it as if expecting someone to open it from the other side. I stepped outside, sipping my coffee, watching the chaos unfold like a morning news segment titled "Entitlement Meets Reality." Corinne came running, actually running down her driveway, waving her arms frantically. No, 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 it should be open. It's supposed to be open. She shot me a death glare so fiery I'm amazed the grass didn't burst into flames. Unlock it, she hissed. Right now. I raised an eyebrow. For what reason? Because, she sputtered, gesturing wildly at her gathering crowd of confused relatives, they need to get to the backyard. They always go through here. Not anymore, I said. They can use your driveway. My driveway is full, she snapped. Not my problem, I replied. You created the situation, you solve it. She stomped her foot like a child who had just been told no candy before dinner. But there was nothing she could do. The lock held. The gate stayed closed. And her relatives were forced, one by one, to walk around her house, squeezing through her narrow side pathway, carrying food trays, balloons, gifts, folding chairs, and a cooler so large it barely fit. The humiliation on her face was priceless. Every inconvenience her family suffered was a reflection of her lies, her entitlement, her refusal to accept reality. And the best part, I didn't have to lift a finger. I just watched, calm as ever, sipping my coffee while Corinne exploded silently behind her forced smile. She had wanted a shared gate. She had wanted easy access. She had wanted to control something that wasn't hers. Now she had nothing but the consequences of her own behavior. And deep down, as I watched the chaos unfold, a new realization settled in. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning, because the real show, the one Corinne would never forget, had only just started. Saturday afternoon rolled in with the same uneasy stillness as the moments before a summer storm. I already had a feeling Corinne was planning something because her yard had been suspiciously noisy since morning. Chairs scraping, tables unfolding, loud phone calls, and her unmistakable voice barking orders at anyone within range. By noon, the street transformed into a full-blown parade of cars. SUVs idled along the curb, minivans searched for parking, sedans squeezed into impossible spaces, and the confused drivers spilled out onto the pavement with trays of food, helium balloons, birthday banners, floral arrangements, and shiny gift bags dangling from their wrists. This wasn't a brunch. This was an event, bigger, louder, and way more crowded than anything she had thrown so far. Corinne, of course, had prepared her usual directions. I could practically hear her voice echoing in my mind. Just enter through the gate at the end of the cul-de-sac. It's easier. Her favorite lie. Her go-to shortcut. And judging by the way her guests arrived, following the same path, she had given them the same instructions, confident, bold, and entirely dependent on the assumption that my gate still belonged to her. But today, her assumptions were about to self-destruct. Because today, the gate didn't budge. Not for the first guest who marched toward it with an aluminum tray of lasagna. Not for the second guest juggling 2 wrapped gifts and a vegetable platter. Not for the 20 confused people who eventually gathered around the gate, staring at the shiny steel lock like it was an alien artifact dropped from the sky. Their confusion was instant and delicious. One woman tugged the gate. Nothing. A man tried lifting it. No movement. Another person rattled it with both hands, only to step back rubbing their fingers because the metal vibrated with stubborn force. "Is this the right place?" someone asked. "She said go through the gate," another replied. "Well, it's locked," a third pointed out helpfully, as if no one could see the deadbolt the size of a small fist. I watched the entire scene unfold from my porch, sitting comfortably in a wooden chair, sipping cold lemonade, letting the citrus sting linger with each slow sip. I didn't hide. I didn't interfere. I simply observed. The confusion at the gate turned into murmurs, the murmurs into irritation, the irritation into small arguments among strangers who were now uncertain whether they were trespassing, misled, or simply lost. One man cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted toward Corinne's house, "Hello, the gate is locked." Nothing. 10 seconds later, someone else shouted, "Are we supposed to go around?" Still nothing. I could see the irritation spreading like ripples in a pond. People glanced at each other, shrugged, paced in circles, and tried calling Corinne. She didn't answer. Eventually, after nearly 5 full minutes of guest confusion swirling around her perfect event like smoke around a fire, the inevitable happened. Someone walked up to her front door and knocked, loudly. I held my breath for the performance I knew was coming. Karen swung the door open with the dramatics of an actress entering her spotlight. Her hair was styled, her earrings sparkled, her smile was wide but trembling at the edges. "Hi, come in, wait, what's going on? Why is everyone still outside?" "The gate," the guest said, pointing. "It's locked." Karen's face drained of color. "What? The gate, the one you said to enter through?" She blinked rapidly, her expression crumpling like a paper bag caught in the rain. I don't know why the gate is locked. It's shared property. He can't do that." Her voice pitched upward at the end, like she hoped volume could rewrite legal reality. At that moment I decided it was time. I stood up, set my lemonade down, and walked toward the crowd with calm, deliberate steps. Karen saw me approaching and stiffened like a cat spotting a vacuum cleaner. I stopped near the gate and spoke loud enough for every guest and Karen to hear clearly. "Actually," I said, "it's private property. You're trespassing if you enter." The effect was immediate. The guests stepped back as though the ground had suddenly turned into lava. A few even apologized automatically, raising their hands in reflexive guilt. Several murmured, "Oh, I didn't know," or "She told us it was okay," or the ever-popular, "Karen said it was shared." Karen froze, her entire face turning the color of someone holding her breath underwater. Red, then deeper, then edging toward purple. She looked like a pressure cooker about to blow. "That's not true," she shrieked. "It is shared." "It's been shared for years." "Really?" a guest asked doubtfully. "Do you have permission?" Karen opened her mouth. No words came out. She tried again, still nothing. She looked at me with a look that could peel paint off a wall. I kept my expression neutral. "The HOA already confirmed this gate is mine," I said calmly. "There is no shared access. None. Zero, so if anyone enters without permission," I let the sentence hang. A few guests swallowed hard, clearly imagining security cameras, legal trouble, or both. Karen's lips trembled as she stared at me. She wasn't just embarrassed anymore. She was exposed. All her lies, all her entitlement, all her manipulations, they had unraveled in front of an audience she desperately wanted to impress. The guests began drifting away from the gate, some heading toward her driveway, squeezing between cars, others hesitating awkwardly as they tried to figure out how to navigate around her house without stepping on flower beds or knocking over Dacre. Karen stood frozen in the middle of her yard, watching her perfectly planned event collapse into uncomfortable chaos. And I simply walked back to my porch, picked up my lemonade, and took another sip. Because for the first time since this whole war began, Karen had to deal with the consequences of her own lies while I relaxed in the sun and enjoyed the show. Karen didn't walk toward me, she charged. Her steps were loud, fast, and furious, each one pounding against the ground like she was trying to stomp cracks into the earth. Her arms flailed in wild, chaotic arcs, fingers curled like claws, hair bouncing with the momentum of pure rage. If anyone had filmed it, the clip would have gone viral under the caption, "When entitlement goes mobile." "You're ruining my event," she screamed, voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. Several guests winced at the volume. One guy holding a balloon subtly stepped backward. Another woman pretended to check her phone just so she wouldn't make eye contact. Karen didn't notice. She was far too busy imploding. "You're being unreasonable," she continued, pointing at me like I was a misbehaving child caught drawing on the walls. "My guests need that gate." "No," I said calmly, taking a deliberate sip of water. "You need to stop using my yard as your personal hallway." A few guests bit their lips, trying and failing to hide amused smirks. Others just stared, confused, as if they'd stepped into a live soap opera without meaning to. Karen spun toward them, desperate for support. "See," she shrilled. "He's doing this on purpose. He's trying to embarrass me." But embarrassment requires someone else to cause it. Karen was fully self-supplied. She marched to the gate and grabbed the lock, twisting it violently. It didn't move. She shook the gate so hard it rattled, her bracelets clinking like angry wind chimes. It didn't help. She yanked the top bar, nothing. She pulled the bottom corner, still nothing. It was like watching a raccoon rage at a boulder. "Open!" she snapped at the lock, as if yelling orders at metal would suddenly grant her telekinetic powers. "Open right now." The lock, being an inanimate object with a higher IQ than she was displaying, stayed closed. Her guests watched in absolute awkward silence, shifting their weight from foot to foot, wishing they were anywhere else. A kid whispered, "Mom, is she okay?" The mom whispered back, "Just don't look directly at her." Karen turned back toward me, cheeks bright red, hair frizzing at the edges from sheer fury, eyes wide with unfiltered disbelief. "You can't just block off something people have used for years." "People," I repeated. "Or just you?" She sputtered, opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air. I'm part of the community. This affects everyone." "No," I said, voice steady, slow, and annoyingly reasonable. "It affects only you because only you have been trespassing." A wave of whispers rippled through the guests. Some eyebrows lifted. Some heads nodded subtly. Karen saw it. She heard it. And that's when the meltdown shifted from explosive to desperate. The rage started slipping, just a little, replaced by something she absolutely hated feeling: vulnerability. For a moment she stood there breathing hard, staring at me like she couldn't decide whether to yell, cry, or climb the fence like a feral cat. Finally, with a sharp inhale, she screeched, "I'll take this to the HOA again." Her voice cracked at the end, betraying the panic creeping underneath. I raised an eyebrow. "Please do," I said calmly. "I have the footage saved." And just like that, her entire expression collapsed. Panic washed over her features like a bucket of ice water dumped over her head. Her eyes widened first, then her jaw slackened. Then her anger dissolved into something rawer, fear, because she knew. Oh, she knew. The HOA had already warned her clearly, directly, formally about abusing property lines. They had told her trespassing wasn't allowed. They had told her she had no claim to my gate. They had told her any further violations could result in fines, penalties, or worse. And now she was on camera, trespassing, lying, directing her guests onto someone else's land, harassing a homeowner on his own property, and publicly melting down in front of at least 30 witnesses. Her voice, once loud enough to startle birds out of trees, shrank into a trembling whisper. You would." "I would," I said. "And I will." She swallowed hard. For a moment she didn't speak. She didn't yell. She didn't rush to defend herself. She simply stood there, trapped between fury and the terrifying realization that she had finally pushed too far. Behind her, her guests watched with an uncomfortable mixture of sympathy, embarrassment, and fascination, like spectators unable to look away from a slow-motion train wreck. One guest quietly whispered, "She's in trouble." Another murmured, "The HOA already warned her last time." A third sighed, "Karen, just let it go." But Karen didn't let things go, ever. Letting go wasn't in her nature. She clenched her fists, jaw tight, body vibrating with the tension of someone who desperately wanted to fight but no longer had any legal ground under her feet. "This isn't fair," she said weakly. "It's my event, and this," I replied, "is my gate." She opened her mouth to argue again, but nothing came out, because every possible angle she could use had already been destroyed. The HOA had ruled. The footage existed. The guests had witnessed everything, and she had already embarrassed herself more thoroughly than anything I could have done intentionally. Slowly, like a balloon deflating, she backed away from the gate. Not gracefully, not quietly, more like someone trying to retreat without admitting they've lost. As she shuffled toward her house, cheeks burning, eyes glossy, shoulders tight with humiliation, her guests followed, hesitant, silent, unsure whether to pretend nothing happened or acknowledge the meltdown they had just witnessed. And as I stood there watching her retreat, one thing became perfectly clear. Karen wasn't done fighting, but she was finally afraid of losing. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only follows a neighborhood scandal, and as I sipped my coffee, half expecting yet another angry email from Karen, I instead heard a firm, deliberate knock on my door. When I opened it, the HOA board president stood there, not with his usual polite posture, but with the weary expression of a man who had finally reached the limit of dealing with the same troublesome homeowner over and over again. "Thank you for reporting this," he said immediately, as if he had rehearsed it on the walk over. "We've issued Karen a formal violation. She's banned from directing anyone through your property." His tone carried the weight of finality, almost relief, as though the entire board had been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to put an official stop to her antics. In his hand, a neatly folded letter bore the HOA seal and the unmistakable red mark of violation notice. along with a second sheet detailing a $500 fine. The president handed it to me like evidence, explaining that they had reviewed the security footage I submitted, cross-checked it with previous complaints, and held an emergency meeting the night before. According to him, the decision was unanimous. Karen, they concluded, had repeatedly abused property boundaries, ignored earlier warnings, and lied at least twice to the board about having permission to use my gate for her guests. They were done giving her the benefit of the doubt. He apologized, genuinely, saying the HOA should have intervened sooner, but her pattern of behavior had finally become impossible to excuse. I nodded, thanked him, and watched as he walked back down my driveway with the slow, tired steps of someone hoping this would be the last time he had to come here about her. But of course, it wasn't the end. Not with Karen. Within an hour, she was outside packing up and down her lawn like a storm trapped inside a single person, phone clutched in her hand as she dialed number after number, board members, neighbors, anyone she thought she could convince that she was the victim of some grand injustice. I could hear her voice carrying through the air, full of dramatic outrage. "This is ridiculous. He's targeting me. That gate is shared." But nobody was buying it anymore. The neighbors she tried to rally pretended to be busy, offering short, dismissive replies, and a few outright walked away. She filed an appeal with the HOA, insisting that the violation was unfair, unsupported, and based on edited footage. A claim that made the board roll their eyes so hard the president later joked he almost strained a muscle. The appeal required a formal review, so Karen marched into the meeting room the next evening with a thick folder of printed screenshots, old email threads taken out of context, and a speech she clearly wrote to sound authoritative. But the board had something stronger: the property map, the HOA bylaws, the complaint history, and most damning of all, the complete, unedited footage showing her directing multiple guests through my yard, encouraging them to use the shortcut as if she owned the place. When they played the video on the projector, her face reportedly drained of color. She tried to argue that the map was outdated, then that the footage was misleading, then that she didn't understand the property line, and finally, when all else failed, that the HOA was discriminating against her. The board rejected every single claim. They reminded her of the previous warnings, the rules she agreed to when she purchased her home, and the fact that property boundaries were not a matter of interpretation. The review lasted less than 20 minutes before they ended the meeting and upheld the violation. Appeal denied. Fine confirmed. Restrictions enforced. Karen left the room fuming, her heels clicking so sharply that one board member later joked it sounded like a woodpecker trapped inside the building. The next morning, the $500 fine was processed, quietly, reluctantly, but undeniably paid. I saw the receipt myself when the board emailed me a case closed notification stating that the matter had been resolved. The violation was now permanent on her record, and any future incidents would escalate directly to legal action. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more strangers walking past my windows. No more unwelcome shortcuts. No more entitled claims of shared property. Karen avoided eye contact for days, puffed up with silent resentment but powerless to do anything about it. Her guests stopped parking near my fence entirely, and the once constant trickle of uninvited foot traffic vanished overnight. The gate stayed locked. The cameras stayed on, and Karen, at least temporarily, stayed in her lane. What struck me most wasn't the fine itself, but the shift in the atmosphere. Everyone finally understood the pattern. Karen didn't just cross literal boundaries. She crossed social ones, legal ones, personal ones. And this time she had been caught so thoroughly that even she couldn't twist the narrative to save herself. The HOA had spoken, the final word delivered, the consequences enforced, and the entitlement that once felt unstoppable now stumbling under its own weight. And as I watched Karen retreat into her house, muttering under her breath, pulling her blinds down too hard, acting like the world had wronged her instead of the other way around, I realized something simple but satisfying. She had finally discovered that rules apply to her too, and that, in this neighborhood, was worth more than the $500 she had to pay. After the HOA's final ruling, an unexpected calm settled over my property, the kind of peace that feels almost surreal after weeks of chaos, confrontation, and constant surveillance of Corinne's antics. The gate, now fortified with a heavy-duty lock and clear signage, had become the ultimate boundary, both literal and symbolic, and it had worked exactly as intended. For the first time in months, no strangers wandered across my lawn, no cars idled awkwardly in my driveway, and the usual parade of Corinne's guests, balloons, gift bags, food trays, and oversized coolers in tow, was conspicuously absent. The sound of footsteps on my grass had been replaced by the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds, and the distant hum of normal neighborhood activity. I spent mornings on my porch, sipping coffee or lemonade, watching the sunlight shift across the yard, noticing details I hadn't had the mental space to appreciate before. The curve of the old oak tree, the tiny wildflowers near the fence, the way the shadows of the picket fence lines moved slowly with the day. Life had finally returned to what it should have been. My life, uninterrupted by entitlement, manipulation, or baseless demands. Occasionally, I would see Corinne in the distance, a shadow behind her curtains or a silhouette by her driveway, her posture stiff, jaw tight, and eyes narrowing as if calculating the next impossible scheme. Sometimes she would step out briefly, glancing at the locked gate with the same mixture of irritation and disbelief that had characterized her meltdown days before. Her presence was tense, controlled, and carefully measured. Unlike before, she never dared approach the gate, never attempted to rally guests or direct anyone toward my property, and never opened her mouth to argue. She had learned, finally, that yelling shared property or gesturing wildly could not override legal documentation, common sense, or physical security. The cameras I had installed recorded everything, but nothing needed to be captured anymore. There were no new transgressions to monitor. My lawn remained pristine, my toolshed unmolested, and my boundaries respected in ways that had once seemed impossible. Neighbors, once wary or silent, began to approach again with casual greetings. Small conversations resumed over fences, dogs barked without triggering frantic disputes, and community life continued without the shadow of Corinne's entitlement looming over every interaction. I even noticed that the minor annoyances, the misdirected delivery trucks, the occasional lost visitor, no longer triggered anxiety because they were, this time, truly accidental, temporary, and entirely manageable. Corinne's absence from my yard, both literal and figurative, had restored a sense of order that no polite warning or repeated confrontation had ever achieved. Occasionally, I would catch snippets of her muttering under her breath, phrases like "ridiculous," "he has no right," or "this isn't fair" floating across the space between our properties. But they were empty threats, hollow words that had no power over my reality. The lock, the documents, the HOA ruling, and the shared knowledge among the neighborhood had created a barrier stronger than any argument, confrontation, or temper tantrum she could muster. Over time, the tension that had built up in previous weeks dissipated completely, replaced by confidence, calm, and a quiet satisfaction in knowing that ownership, responsibility, and clearly defined boundaries had prevailed. Every glance at the gate now reminded me of the principle I had defended so fiercely. That entitlement alone cannot override rights, that rules exist to protect everyone's space, and that patience, planning, and decisive action can transform a seemingly hopeless conflict into a lasting resolution. Life returned to normal in a way that was almost cinematic, the sun casting long shadows over a well-kept lawn, birds chirping in harmonious patterns, neighbors exchanging polite nods or smiles as they passed by, and Corinne, ever the looming presence of past drama, reduced to silent observation from a safe distance. Her once dominant gestures, her accusations, and her confident assumptions had been replaced by caution, awareness, and I suspect, a lingering sense of defeat. In a way, her silence was more powerful than any confrontation. She had nothing to say because she had finally learned that shouting, scheming, or directing chaos could not override law, reason, or evidence. Ownership was clear. Respect was restored. And the locked gate had become both a literal and symbolic boundary that reminded everyone, herself included, that rules, responsibility, and personal property are not negotiable. The lesson was subtle but undeniable. You can scream shared property all you want, you can stomp, argue, or manipulate, but the truth, backed by legal confirmation, reinforced physical barriers, and the silent observance of a community, prevails over entitlement. On quiet evenings, I would stand by the gate, watch the sunset reflect off the steel lock, and feel a deep sense of satisfaction. No trespassers, no shortcuts, no intrusions. Just a calm, orderly space that was mine to enjoy, maintained and respected in a way that words alone could never achieve. And Karen, peeking occasionally from her driveway, jaw tight and eyes full of resentment, had finally internalized the reality she had long refused to acknowledge. Her voice, her entitlement, and her frustration could not change the law, the lock, or the clarity of ownership. She never says a word now, never tries again, and her actions have retreated into silence. Because she finally learned the ultimate lesson. Possession, backed by evidence and enforcement, outweighs entitlement. You can scream shared property as loud as you like. You can direct guests. You can stomp and shout and attempt every possible argument, but at the end of the day, the lock listens only to ownership, not to entitlement, and in that truth, respect, long overdue and hard won, was finally restored. After Karen's spectacular meltdown and the HOA's final ruling, the effects rippled through the neighborhood faster than I could have anticipated. It started subtly at first, little signs of acknowledgement and unspoken respect, gestures that spoke louder than any words could. On my morning walks, I noticed neighbors holding back from straying too close to my fence, stepping around my property lines with a careful deliberateness they hadn't bothered to maintain before. Cars no longer skirted the edge of my lawn or parked haphazardly near the gate. Instead, drivers slowed, nodded politely, or even gave me a thumbs up as they passed, a silent acknowledgement that my property had been defended and that the rules were now being observed. Children who once ran across my yard with complete disregard for boundaries now waved politely from the sidewalk, stopping just short of crossing the invisible line I had made unmistakably clear. Even Karen's usual enablers, the neighbors who had previously laughed at her antics, followed her instructions, or quietly excused her entitlement, kept their distance. They no longer tried to navigate my property as if it were an extension of hers. They watched quietly, learned the lesson through observation, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The transformation in the neighborhood's behavior was subtle but pervasive. Small conversations began to hint at approval and relief. People shared knowing glances, whispered affirmations about respecting boundaries, and began quietly reshaping how the community interacted with one another, all without confrontation or argument. The shift wasn't loud, but it was profound. One evening, a knock at my door pulled me out of my routine. I opened it to find one of my neighbors, smiling awkwardly but clearly sincere, holding a small potted plant as a token of neighborly goodwill. "Your gate," they said, pausing to collect the right words. It changed everything. People finally respect boundaries now. The trespassing, the shortcuts, all of that, it stopped because you drew the line and enforced it. You didn't yell. You didn't escalate unnecessarily. You just made it clear. Their words hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Satisfaction, yes, but also a sense of surreal detachment. A simple lock, something most people would have considered a mundane tool, had done what repeated arguments, polite warnings, or neighborhood gossip had failed to accomplish for months. It wasn't just about keeping Karen and her guests out. It was about setting a precedent, establishing control through clarity, and creating an environment where rules were respected because they were visible, undeniable, and enforceable. The neighbors smiled and shook their head. Honestly, it's remarkable. Just a lock and a sign, and everything shifted. I thanked them, accepted the plant, and watched as they walked back down the street, the quiet acknowledgement leaving a lingering warmth that contrasted sharply with the months of tension, frustration, and constant vigilance I had endured. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood dynamic continued to change. Parents began instructing children about boundaries in a way that was consistent and unambiguous. Guests attending events at other homes now approached driveways and properties with care, checking first and avoiding assumptions about access. Even casual walkers and joggers respected property lines, perhaps unconsciously influenced by the clear example I had set. Corinne herself became a peripheral figure, occasionally visible behind her curtains, sometimes glancing toward my gate with a mixture of irritation and grudging awareness, but never acting. Her presence became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood, a living reminder of what happens when entitlement meets clearly enforced boundaries. What struck me most, however, was how little confrontation was needed to create this change. I hadn't needed to yell, argue endlessly, or engage in retaliatory behavior. The line had been drawn simply, clearly, and with an unambiguous tool: the lock. And because it was backed by legal confirmation, HOA support, and visible enforcement, the neighborhood learned the lesson without additional conflict. Life felt quieter, steadier, and more predictable. I could enjoy my mornings on the porch, watch children play in the street without fear of trespass, and sip lemonade while observing a community subtly realigning itself around respect for boundaries. Corinne's presence, once an omnipresent source of stress and drama, now barely registered, a background note in a neighborhood that had finally adopted a rhythm of order and awareness. The lesson, simple as it seemed, had far-reaching consequences. Control wasn't about force or escalation. It was about clarity, consistency, and ensuring that boundaries were unmistakable and respected. One silent nod from a neighbor, one careful step around my yard, one polite wave from a child, each became a testament to the effectiveness of standing firm with composure and strategic decisiveness. I realized with a quiet satisfaction that bordered on disbelief that in a community filled with chatter, assumptions, and entitlement, the most powerful statements could be made silently. A lock, a sign, and adherence to principle had shifted the balance, restored order, and ensured respect. And as I watched the evening sun cast long shadows across my now undisturbed yard, I understood fully that sometimes control isn't about confrontation. It isn't about arguing louder or proving a point with dramatics or spectacle. It's about drawing the line clearly, enforcing it consistently, and letting the consequences of clarity speak louder than any shouting, any tantrum, or any entitlement ever could. From that day forward, the neighborhood operated differently. People understood that boundaries existed, that personal property mattered, and that violations had consequences that could not be ignored. Corinne's outbursts became isolated incidents, referenced only in whispered stories about past chaos. Respect, once abstract and aspirational, had become tangible, and it was all because the line had been drawn and enforced, without compromise, without hesitation, and without drama beyond the necessary measure. The change was complete, the lesson unmistakable, and the peace profound, proving in the simplest terms that ownership and clarity outweigh entitlement, that subtle influence often has more power than loud confrontation, and that sometimes the smallest tools, like a lock and a sign, can create the largest ripple of change. Months passed, and the neighborhood finally settled into a rhythm that felt almost unimaginable during the chaos of Corinne's relentless antics. Her events became quieter, smaller, carefully confined to her own property, far removed from my yard, my gate, and my peace of mind. The few times she attempted to organize a gathering, the invitation seemed hesitant, restrained, and accompanied by a polite distance that was entirely new. The HOA occasionally had to step in to mediate minor disputes, small complaints, fleeting concerns, and occasional misunderstandings. But by then, I had established a system that made those interactions more formal than confrontational. Cameras monitored the perimeter, strategically placed signs served as clear warnings, and I maintained a calm, firm demeanor that discouraged escalation while signaling readiness. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. I realized that the lessons from this experience were far deeper than merely protecting property lines. They were lessons in assertiveness, in maintaining and enforcing boundaries, and in understanding the consequences of repeated entitlement. Karen, despite her persistent arrogance and dramatic flair, was ultimately bound by rules and evidence, much like anyone else, and the moment she encountered unambiguous, firm boundaries, her attempts to manipulate or bully were rendered powerless. This taught me that control over one's environment isn't about trying to control other people. It's about controlling what you allow them to touch, access, or influence. You cannot change an entitled mindset, nor can you always sway someone who believes the world revolves around their convenience. But you can control the conditions under which they interact with your space, your life, and your boundaries. Even the simplest, most unassuming actions, like installing a lock, posting a sign, or calmly presenting documentation, can speak louder than arguments, meetings, or repeated complaints. They communicate clarity, enforce standards, and establish consequences without the need for conflict. Over time, the neighborhood absorbed the lesson in its own way. Neighbors became more aware of their own boundaries and those of others. Respect for personal space increased subtly but persistently. Children, once unconcerned with fences and private property, learned that lines are not arbitrary. They are meaningful and enforceable. Adults adjusted their habits, understanding that ignoring someone else's property or rights could lead to predictable, documented outcomes. Karen's presence, once a constant source of anxiety and disruption, became a distant, passive background in the community. Her attempts at influence dwindled, her voice carried less authority, and her ability to disrupt was neutralized. I could observe her from my porch without worry, noting only the contrast between her past behavior and the current calm. The satisfaction was quiet, almost meditative, yet profound. It was not the loud, dramatic victory of confrontation or revenge. It was the steady, enduring reassurance that boundaries were recognized, respected, and effective. The peace I now experienced was rooted in preparation, decisiveness, and clarity rather than brute force or escalation. The lessons endured beyond Karen. They applied to anyone who might attempt to overstep, anyone who assumed compliance without consent, anyone who believed entitlement superseded rules. By maintaining clear boundaries, documenting enforcement, and using simple yet firm tools to protect space, I realized I could navigate conflict efficiently and without unnecessary stress. The ultimate lesson was deceptively simple. Respect is earned through consistency, ownership is reinforced by visibility and enforcement, and entitlement only holds power when boundaries are unclear or undefended. Sitting on the porch in the fading light, watching the neighborhood function in calm equilibrium, I understood that the smallest actions, locking a gate, posting a clear sign, maintaining a calm stance, could ripple outward to create profound change. There was no need for constant vigilance, no requirement for aggressive confrontation, only a consistent commitment to protecting what is yours. In the end, the victory was not in punishing Karen, intimidating guests, or proving a point. The victory was in reclaiming peace, asserting control over my own space, and witnessing a community quietly recalibrate itself around respect and understanding. It was subtle, sustainable, and deeply satisfying. The neighborhood had learned, I had learned, and Karen had learned her place. The lesson in boundaries, consequences, and the quiet power of deliberate action remained, firmly etched into the rhythm of daily life. And as I closed the gate each evening, the lock clicking in place, I felt a rare but profound sense of contentment. The understanding that control, clarity, and respect, once established, are more powerful than any confrontation or argument, and that the simplest tools, applied decisively, often yield the sweetest and most lasting victory of all.